Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net, and welcome to today's video. What we're going to be taking a look at is a time-lapse demonstration of a commission that I was kindly offered by the one and only, the wonderful creator Dave Brink for a comic book titled Perfect 10. And I got the opportunity to draw up two characters from this beautiful book, Perfect 10 herself, and of course, American Bliss, a character that I was very, very keen to illustrate. So let's roll the time-lapse demonstration here and get right into it. Alright, so this is how I start out pretty much any illustration that I decide to tackle. I begin with a very rough, very rudimentary, low-key thumbnail concept. And this allows me to do multiple things. It allows me to get all my ideas down onto the page so I can see what I'm working with. And I don't know sometimes what ideas are rolling around inside the old noggin. So this helps me to get them all out of my system in front of me so that I can pick from the very best. And that's really what I'm searching for here, the best option. And oftentimes the first idea that I come up with isn't necessarily going to work out to be the one that I ultimately decide is going to represent the final presentation. And certainly this is the case when I show them to the actual client and I offer these to the client. I say, hey, here's the ideas that I'm playing with. What do you think? What one stands out to you the most? And what's really cool is oftentimes they don't pick the one that I think that they're going to pick. It's a complete surprise to me. So here's the thing that you got to understand when you're working for a client, when they hire you to do up an illustration for them. Sometimes they don't know what they want, but they certainly know what they don't want. And making sure that you figure out exactly what that is before you jump into the final illustration, well, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing because you certainly don't want to tackle the finished illustration, get to the end only to realize it was never what the client wanted or was after. So you got to figure that out right from the beginning. But once you have it figured out, once you've shown it to the client said, yep, that's the one I'm digging, then you can take it into the next phase of development, which is what I'm going through here. I'm going over the top of that very rough thumbnail sketch. And that thumbnail sketch, I know it's rough and I know it's messy looking, but do not underestimate it because trust me, it's holding within it a lot of important information as far as the composition is concerned, the placement of the characters, what kind of pose they're going to have. And with that, you're able to lay in the anatomy and the costume design right in on top. Okay, so you don't have to think about the concept itself. You don't have to dedicate brain ramage to that particular portion of the illustration, right? And that optimizes the process for you. It leaves you room to think about, okay, well, how am I going to structure the anatomy for this beautiful female character too, if you will, which I have had the wonderful, wonderful privilege to be able to whip up here. I like drawing female characters. I find them very, very fun to illustrate. I don't know what it is about them. It could be the curves. It could be the anatomy. It could be the sleekness. I have no idea, but they certainly have a different energy about them than male characters do. And so what I'm focused on at this point is exactly that, making sure the anatomy is all where it needs to be, making sure that those key muscle groups are, scaled up and positioned properly. But more than that, I want to capture a good shape for them because shape is everything, especially for a more stylized illustration, which is what I'm going to end up with here later on down the line when I really start to polish it up. In other words, I want to make sure that those outside contours are looking sharp, slick, and energetic. I want to add some visual interest to them. Look, the last thing you want, especially when you're describing the outside shape of different muscle structures or areas of the body, is this very meek outline that's kind of curvaceous, doesn't really have any sharp corners. It looks weak as a contour. And so you want to avoid that at all costs. And one of the best ways to avoid it is to push that energy right in the beginning, exaggerate it almost, because inevitably, as you start to refine your illustration and you bring it through further to a close, what ends up happening is you lose that energy. It's just a simple truth of the matter is that you really do, you lose that initial burst of gesture that those sketches, those very rough, rudimentary preliminaries had within them. And this is simply the case because of the fact that the lines you start off with are messy. They've got a lot of movement to them. They've got a lot of gesture. They've got some soul to them. And when you start to clean them up, when you start to refine them with a single contour, well, you better make sure that you lay down that darn contour very, very carefully, because if you don't, you're going to lose all of that. You're going to lose the energy, you're going to lose the movement, and you'll end up with a very stiff, lifeless looking drawing, which is not what most of us comic book artists are seeking. Okay, once the anatomy is done, we get to the fun part. We're able to lay in the costuming right in on top and start to further push the definition of those shapes that we're defining the anatomy with. Now, the important thing about figuring out the anatomy of a character before you start to lay in the costuming on top is because you got to fit that costuming around the anatomy. Okay, so without the anatomy, you can't do that. So, again, you want to make sure you've got a very clear idea of exactly what the anatomy entails. And then when you go to place the clothing around the forms of the legs, of the arms, of the body, the torso, around the boobies and the butt and the whatever else, what you want to make sure of is that the especially the horizontal contours, so the portions of the outfit that are actually wrapping around the arm, follow the, or whatever form it is you're working with, follow the form, right? They follow the curve of that form, the surface of that form. You're describing it with those cross contours. That's what an outfit enables you to be able to do, is to describe form without actually needing to place in any rendering. No need for cross-hatching, no need for shadows. You're all good if you're placing that costuming around the anatomy of your character in the right way. But that really takes care of the underlying sketch. You know, it's done, it's dusted. Am I going to bother to take it through to a more refined point? No, not really. I'm just going to jump straight into the inks because, you know, it takes me long enough to complete an illustration without going ahead and refining the pencils and then jumping into the inks and doing the exact same thing anyway. So I just jump straight into the inks. Doing this allows me to be a little more spontaneous as well. You know, I haven't already refined the finished line work, and so I can make those decisions right now during the inking phase, could polish up the contours, make them look all nice and beautiful and clean and sharp. And that's really what the inking process is all about. You know, the time to think has been completed. It's past, it's done. You don't need to do that anymore. Really, all you need to do is follow what you've already laid down onto the page and try to capture a great level of aesthetic appeal within those finished inked contours, because this is going to be in the final presentation, baby. This is what's going to be presented. So if you don't get this right now, it's not going to be right. So I always try to take my time at this point. Yes, it's important to work with haste in order to maintain the level of energy within your line work that you need to have there by the end. It's got to remain. It's got to be preserved as much as possible. But still, if you mess up along the way, if you find that things just aren't working out as you thought they would, you got to go back. There's just no two ways about it. You've got to go back and you've got to fix it. You've got to make sure that it's exactly spot on so that you can end up with the best possible presentation that you can come up with, the epitome of the illustration that you are hoping to cultivate from your very hands. Okay, so that's the way I like to think about it. I get pretty serious about this stuff. I don't like to create artwork, especially that the client is going to be dissatisfied with. It's just not an option for me. To disappoint a client is something that, man, it gives me a guttural reaction. It's something that I never ever want to do. I want to blow away their expectations. I want to make them glad that they hired me in the first place. And from what Dave said, he was happy with what I gave him here, which, you know, brings warmth to my heart to hear that from somebody who, you know, paid me to do an illustration, and what an illustration that I put so much time and effort into. So what I try to focus on right from the get-go when it comes to inking is going around and outlining everything essentially, placing down the main contours. And I do that before I start to place down any sort of rendering, any shadows whatsoever. I'm not concerned with that just yet. I'm just worried about making sure the outline looks as good as I can get it. And so in order to capture that clean, sharp, energetic line work, what I try to do is I do try to speed up just a little bit. I find that the slower I pull out those lines, the more potentially wobbly they can get. And wobbliness is not something that you want within your finished line art. You want it to be smooth. You want it to be, again, you want it to be slick. You want it to glide from one point to the next throughout your illustration. And honestly, if you're really taking your time drawing out those lines, you're not going to be able to capture that energy. It'll be impossible. So what I would highly suggest you do is to just work quickly if you're an inker, and especially if you're a digital inker. If you mess up, it really doesn't matter. You can hit the undo button, and then you can simply have another crack at it. But when you do have a repeat attempt, make sure that you're laying down that line fast, that you've got a little bit of movement behind it. You want your lines to look alive on the page. If they don't look alive, then they're not going to be engaging. They're not going to be fun to look at. You want to draw people into the final presentation. And if you're not giving them something interesting to look at, something that seems to move on the page and pop out at them, then they will simply pass you by. There's too many other things vying for their attention. And so this is why it's important to add a certain level of finesse to your artwork. Make sure it's good to go before you release it out there into the wild. If you haven't made those efforts, if you haven't gone to those lengths, then ultimately you're really just wasting your time. Yes, maybe some people will stop and have a gander, but in all honesty, it's not going to give your artwork the level of attention that you might be expecting, or that it really deserves, if you were to put in that effort. So this especially applies to hair, because hair is, very organic in nature. You can see me again and again having one attempt after the other, trying to get those lines nice and smooth. I'm hitting that undo button like a madman. And I'm repeating the process. They say that the definition of madness is to continue doing something only to get the same result. And that happens to me a lot. So I don't know what that says about me. But, eventually I'm very, very happy with the outcome of this hair. I get that gorgeous movement within it. Hair is a wonderful thing because here's a little tip. It's going to add additional gesture to your character. It's just going to make them look like there's more movement. And also, on top of that, what you'll find is that there's a certain amount of additional believability which is applied to the overall scene, because now all of a sudden, if the hair of your character is blowing around in the wind, or it's getting wet by the rain, or it's at the whim of the environmental conditions that character has been placed in, it creates a sense of place for that character. It means what it subconsciously tells the audience. It's telling them that that character is actually in a world of their very own, and that they are subject to that world. That what happens in that world is going to affect them in some way. Now, I know that's probably thinking about it on possibly too much of a deep level, but on a subconscious level, that's certainly what is being played back to the viewer. So here's where things get interesting, and really probably the meat of this particular demonstration is what I want to talk about here. Because you can see that I'm laying in some shadows, and I got to tell you, those shadows are not present in the final presentation, nor is the rendering you're about to see me place in on top of these characters. Typically I like to do very dark, gloomy, detailed, high detailed work. And unfortunately, even though, hey, that looks great in a dark fantasy genre, which, I'm certainly working in with Kozor. By the way, you can check Kozor out via the link in the description below. And what you'll notice is the artwork in Kozor is significantly different to the artwork that I'm demonstrating for you right here, at least what it'll end up as. And so, depending on the genre of art that I'm doing, I've got two particular styles that I like to go for, two directions that I tend to go in. Either a clean, stylized, Michael Turnerish slash J. Scott Campbell appearance for my art, or a more detailed Mark Silvestri, David Finch aesthetic. Okay, and I've got to be careful about which one I decide to go with for the various commissions that I decide to do. And oftentimes I'll send two examples of these styles to the client and I'll ask them, I'll say, hey, how do you want me to present the finished rendition of this artwork? Do you want the more detailed, lots of shadow, dark, gloomy, moody look? Or do you want the clean cut, room to breathe appearance instead? And I was a little bit confused here. I got a little bit lost. For some reason or another, I thought that the dark, gloomy style would fit the particular theme of this piece. And I made attempt after attempt to try and get it to do exactly that, to try and get it to fit. But it was just not working out for me. And, again, maybe I am a little bit mad because I kept on trying to make it work and spent so much time doing it that was simply wasted. I could have finished this illustration long before I actually called it complete, but I didn't. Instead, I was messing around with it. I was going through these weird little struggles that I really didn't need to go through whatsoever, only to realize at the very end my blunder. And so, just a word to the wise. I think that in the end, most people don't have two styles. They don't have two styles that they work with. They develop that one style that they become recognized for. And that's wonderful. That's great. Just make sure that style, if you do stick with only one, ensure that it is going to be able to bend to the whims of the various genres and themes out there that your artwork may potentially fall into. Because a dark fantasy style may not necessarily suit a sci-fi fantasy style. It might not suit, the kind of artwork that you might see in The Darkness or Witchblade might not suit the kind of artwork you would see in My Little Pony, as an example. And so you've got to decide exactly, what your artwork is most appropriate for as far as genre and theme is concerned. But then on top of that, maybe you want to come up with multiple styles. Maybe you don't just want to stick to one. Maybe you want to have, a backup style just in case you get asked to do a commission for a particular piece of work that maybe your default style or the other style you tend to work in doesn't quite suit. Now, here's the thing. If a client hires you to do something, usually most of the time, they're going to have some idea of the kind of work that you typically like to do. And they'll expect their commission to be rendered in the same way. And Dave Brink, I'm not sure how much he cared for all of this crazy detail that I was adding in or all the really dark shadows and whatnot. But I do know that one thing that stood out to him about my artwork was the way in which I drew female faces. Okay, he told me that specifically. He said, Clayton, no one draws female faces in the way that you do. And so I knew that he was hiring me for the female faces, so I wasn't going to change them up in any dramatic way. But you can see here, again, I'm laying in those render lines. I'm going through so much pain here. I feel like I'm in some kind of a rendering hell. And I just can't seem to get those hatches to follow the form of the leg in the way in which I want them to, in order to describe its form correctly. And This is one of the big challenges you'll run into, especially if you decide to go for those more detailed styles. And look, this is possibly because, you know, I've got, I've got some experience behind me, but as far as being completely comfortable with rendering, I don't have that much experience that I'm going to be in that place just yet. And so for me, I'm still finding my way as far as laying in these cross hatches, at least at this point. Right now, of course, when I go to draw something, I feel pretty confident with my rendering. I feel like I've got it down to a T. But back when I was doing this illustration, I really didn't feel confident as I do now. And so when you don't feel confident in what you're doing, well, you start to overthink things and you start to make decisions that maybe will work and maybe won't work, as opposed to if you got that little bit more experience behind you, it's completely different. You make a decision, and that's the decision you're making, and it's probably the right one, and you're not going to be too concerned if it's not, right? You have a certain blaseness about the decisions you make. It doesn't really occur to you that it could be wrong. It doesn't really occur to you that it could be right. It just looks good. It's like magic on the page. Unlike at this point here within my artistic journey when, I was still, rendering had always been, for some reason, a concern for me. I could do it, and probably if I thought about it less, I'd be better at it. But, I kept overthinking it, second guessing myself. And so you can see me re-throwing in the exact same pattern of hatches over and over again in the same section, torturing myself, absolutely torturing myself, only to realize, as I said, spoiler alert, in the end, that I was going to throw all of this out and I wasn't going to use it at all. And you know what? The funny thing is that when when you do something like this, especially if you got family members that you live with who like to check in on your art and see what you're up to with it, or friends for that matter, they'll look at what you're doing and they'll be like, dude, are you crazy? Like, what the hell is going on here? This looked good already the first time around, and it looks good now. So why are you erasing and redoing things constantly? Um, and I'll admit I have to explain myself, like, and I can't explain what the hell it is I'm doing. It's difficult to explain it to you right now. I feel quite frankly embarrassed sharing this time-lapse demonstration with you. I come across like I know what I'm doing, but I really don't. I'm guessing a lot of the time. Maybe it'll work out and maybe it won't. I'm still an overthinker. I'm a big overthinker. I think the older that I get and the more that I draw, sure, one of the wonderful things about that is you do start to relax a little bit and you don't overthink things as much. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. You get to know the tools that you like to use when it comes to drawing. And you get to know the techniques and the methods that you'll typically lean on when it comes to creating the illustrations that you would like to create. But, there's still certainly room for error, and there's still certainly times where you'll want to challenge yourself. You certainly never want to become so blasé that, or complacent for that matter. You never want to fall into complacency because that's when you screw up and you don't even realize you're screwing up. And that is where you start out as an artist. You're making mistakes that you can't even pick up yet because of your inexperience. So you never want to, regress to that point. You still want to be kept on your toes. You want those little challenges to pop up before you. The difference is that eventually they become fun instead of stressful. And I was stressed out at this point. Look, I'm rendering out the skin. I'm rendering out the body here. And maybe you're looking at this and you're going, hey, that didn't look half bad. But for me, whatever was going through my mind at that point in time, I absolutely hated it. It was something that was absolutely killing me and haunting my process. And I just couldn't get this piece done. Again, so much wasted time, hours of wasted time. And so, the thing is, you've got to go through this though. At least I did. Maybe not everybody needs to. Sometimes I think about the pros. I think about people like Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, and I wonder if they tortured themselves in the same way or if they just didn't give a shit after a while. And I don't have an answer to that question, but I think that the reason I overthink things so much is I just really care a lot. I really want to make sure that I give people a memorable experience when they take the time, when they stop on by to look at my artwork. And if I can't do that, if I don't, like, here's the thing, when I was younger and I would see a kick-ass piece of artwork, I would be like just filled with inspiration. There would be some kind of energy that would possess me, and I'd be like, that looks sick. I remember feeling that when I first saw one of the first pieces I saw from Louis Royer. It was some chick with a snake around her neck, and it looked amazing. It was absolutely stunning. I couldn't believe what I was observing. And remembering experiences like that is why I work so hard to ensure I'm able to cultivate it within other people when they experience my art. That's what I'm aiming for. That's what I'm striving for in everything I create. If I can't do that, then to me it's not worth it. Like what's the point then? Um but yeah, it's I'd certainly got a lot of practicing in when it comes to rendering throughout this entire process. Sure, I struggled with it, but, I was still laying down hatches onto the page repeatedly over and over and over again. And sometimes I think that if there's something that you're doing that you're just not happy with, you got to grind it out over and over again. You got to get it out of your system. You've got to screw up enough times until you get it right, until you find the pathway out of the damned point at which you found yourself within your process. And I certainly felt that with this particular illustration. I messed around with it so much, and eventually the path was before me at the end, and I was like, what the hell? Right? Like, I went through all of that only to come out the other side. It was like the hero's journey. I'd gone on this giant journey only to come back a little bit wiser. And look, usually it takes me a good night's sleep in order to work out what needs to happen, what I need to do next in order to solve whatever woe I'm experiencing within my art. Because I come back to it and I'll look at the rendering or something like that and I'll go, man, this is completely whack. What the hell have I done here? So at this stage, I eventually gave up on the rendering. I don't even know if I was sure whether or not I was going to pursue it. I was just like, dude, this isn't working out. I need to move on here. I need to get this thing done. And so I got rid of it, or I turned off the layers, one of the two, and I decided to move straight onto the background, which needed to get done. This commission was due. And, even though when it comes to my own stuff, for some reason, I'm horribly slow at producing things, when it comes to, doing client work, I try to make sure I'm as close to on time as possible. If I've got a very tight deadline, I'll definitely meet it. And so I don't know what it is. It could be the accountability, it could be the fear of disappointing somebody, but it's certainly a massive motivator for me. And so, yeah, this needed to get done. As far as the background was concerned, I always knew that I was only going to be using simple contours to define it. But those contours, they needed to be well weighted. In other words, I was applying line weights to them to make sure they had a professional finished quality and level of interest to their appeal, to their finished visual representation. And, if you've just got an outline there that remains the same thickness along its trajectory without varying in terms of heaviness or lightness, then what you're going to end up with is a very boring looking light. And so you want to mix it up a little bit. You want to emphasize certain subjects within the illustration with a thicker outline to draw attention to them. You want to suggest lighting conditions by thickening up the lines on the dark side of an object and keeping them light on the point of the object that is receiving the most amount of light. from the light source. So always keep your light sources in mind, of course. Establish those. Make sure that you know where they are within the scene and how they're projecting down onto the characters and all the other background props and elements that you've included within the piece. So what was I basing this background of? I have no freaking idea. I think I was just making it up as I was going, and I wanted to create something that looked kind of cool and kind of techy, but in the end, all of the shapes that you're seeing, all of the different objects that I've got in the background there, they were really just based upon primitive forms. Okay, so you can see some cylinders, you can see some, they're glorified cylinders essentially. That kind of twist and turn, cylinders on top of cylinders, and then they're broken up with, I guess you could call them secondary forms that are placed right in on top. And really, that's all you need to create something that looks semi-interesting, is start out with a primitive, basic-looking shape that looks kind of boring, and then add stuff to it, place things on top of it. And as long as it looks like it's something, it doesn't need to exist in reality. Doesn't matter, right? I don't know if I was even using any references for this thing. I was just completely winging it and hoping for the best. But you know what? It turned out halfway decent, and it worked for the piece. It worked quite well. You know, I think that when you're thinking about the background that you want to place in behind some characters, really try to consider the theme that you're working within. Again, we're talking about theme here a lot, and it really does come into play in a big way as far as your style is concerned, as far as the subject matter that you include within the piece. And the reason as to why I consider theme when it comes to backgrounds is because if the characters look a certain way, they look like they're a part of a sci-fi world, then I want to make sure that the background behind them resembles exactly that, a sci-fi world. If they're in an interior or an exterior, it doesn't matter. It's got to look sci-fi. Next up, I'm placing a little bit of smoke within the air, you know, some steam coming off these ladies. No, not really, they're just clouds in the background. And I'm keeping them fairly simple. Just like with the hair, I want to keep them flowy. I want to give them some gesture. I want to make them look alive, like there's some movement to them. The last thing we want is stiff smoke, right? You certainly want it to have some energy to it. There's no question about it. Some continuing, you know, adding in little details, cutting up those larger primitive forms, adding bits and pieces on top of them, trying to make them look interesting to look at. And, you know, if they don't, then, you know, I've got to rejig them. I've got to make them look better. So now I've made the decision that I'm not going to render these beautiful ladies, Perfect 10 and American Bliss. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to accept my fate and instead give them a bit more of a Michael Turner, J. Scott Campbell appearance. I'm going to focus on the line weights here and add in just a minimal amount of rendering, only absolutely where necessary, in order to come up with a very clean, polished looking finish. And it worked so incredibly well for these characters. It truly, truly did. You know, you can see that I'm adding in a few drop shadows here and there to these characters. I am still finding it hard to let go of that rendering though, so I'm still playing around with it, trying to figure out what's going to look good and what's not going to look good. What I do at bare minimum is I double up some of those contours with some additional lines, at least in the end. And, you know, that's all that was really required. That was all that was ever really required for this piece. And I feel like that the additional rendering and the shadows, it just kind of made it look messy and incohesive. I didn't want that feel for this particular piece. I didn't think that it suited it. Now, of course, it's, you know, it's different when it comes to the gauntlets that, the forearm armor that American Bliss is wearing. I'm adding some rendering into that because it's appropriate. It works really, really well. You know, there's some reflections going on. There's, you know, some shadows happening within there, and it adds just that little bit more contrast. I'm adding some additional render lines to the hair because of the same reason. It's giving it some contrast. It's making it appear overall darker than the rest of the image. Okay, so it's creating some contrast between the skin and the hair. It's creating some contrast between the hair and the costuming. We want that. Contrast is good. You've just got to be able to really balance it out in order to make it work. If you can't do that, then it's better to just leave it as an outline, leave it at that, put in the bare minimum and hope for the best. Values are everything. And the reason for that is because you can really use contrast to lead the viewer's eye throughout the piece. It gives them a pathway that they can follow in order to have a much more fruitful experience. And that's a really good thing. The last thing you want is for them to feel lost when they look at your artwork, to feel confused in any way. The moment they start to feel confused, they can't make sense of what's happening, well, you may as well say goodbye to that wonderful, wonderful observer of your work, because they won't be an admirer, that's for sure. Instead, they will just simply slip away. They will become bored. They will frown a little bit. They will furrow their brow, and they will decide that they don't like what they're looking at. So certainly ensure that your artwork is as readable and visually digestible as possible. You don't want to make your viewers visually constipated. That's certainly not something that you are looking to achieve when you set out to create an illustration. So avoid it at all costs. I've done the same thing with Perfect 10's hair. I've gone ahead, I've added in some additional rendering lines, but I haven't rendered the hair out in the same way that I was approaching the rendering throughout their bodies previously. Instead, I simply doubled up on the line work, the primary lines. I added in lighter lines around them, just in order to add points of thickness where required. You can see here I'm struggling to really let go of those hatches, and I'm trying to add them in here and there, trying to get away with it, but it's simply not working out. This piece, it really had a mind of its own. I got to tell you, it was going its own way right from the very beginning, and we were fighting. I was like, no, I want you to look like this, and the piece was like, no, I want to look like this. And eventually I had to take the knee and bow down to my master, because really an artwork takes on a life of its own eventually, and you've got to respect that. Honestly, sometimes the muse just kicks in, and she wants her own way. You've got to let go sometimes. You've got to let go of what you want for the artwork and go with the flow, baby. What I was trying to really get out of the rendering here as I worked is, what was the point of it? What was the point of all that effort that I was trying to go to? Well, I wanted to create some contrast, once again, between the costuming and the tone of her skin. So I wanted the costuming to look darker than the anatomy. And, well, I think that that simply wasn't needed. It wasn't something that was required in the end. It still worked very, very well. And the colorist that came in afterward and took this piece to a whole other level really, really made it so that whatever effort I was trying to put into the rendering and the distinctions between the costuming and the skin, it really didn't matter. They did the job for me. And so, yeah, it was really just a complete waste of time, and it sucked. There's nothing worse than taking a certain route within your comic book art and realizing that you weren't supposed to go down that path, that it would have been better if you stayed on track in the first place. There was a lot of work here that I did that I didn't need to do, that I didn't keep in the end anyway, and that was unfortunate. But you know what? By the time I'd finished this particular illustration, I was very happy with what I'd ended up with. And thankfully, so was Dave. He was 100% pleased with what I'd given him. And that's really all that I could hope for. And, looking back at American Bliss and Perfect 10 and the piece that I was able to illustrate for them, I'm very happy with that clean cut graphic look that I decided to go for. It worked so well, and I would love to revisit it again And I have revisited it again for other commissions, certainly, because, certain people who have hired me have said, yeah, I want the clean cut look. I think it looks great. It's going to work really well for my characters. It fits in with the theme of my comic book. So that just goes to show that it is actually quite important sometimes to give your clients that option. And maybe they won't go for it. Maybe they'll go for your standard style, and that's wonderful. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Sometimes you can just tell with certain clients what it is they're after, and that's good as well. But so what I'm doing now is I'm adding some very subtle texture details to the background elements there. Just to give them some scuff, make them look a little bit worn and torn, and give them some character. If I just left it completely bare, well, it'll look a little bit visually boring. And visual boredom, again, is something that we do not want to put our viewers through. Okay, we want to give them an engaging experience that they're completely and 100% satisfied with. That's what we're doing at the end of the day as comic book artists, is providing an experience. So, here I'm adding in some, you can see once again that I've added in those drop shadows, and they're the perfect points of contrast just to really indicate the forms that are casting them. And I think that it works very, very well. That's all that's needed. It's all about sometimes not what you include, but what you don't include, what you leave out. So that is, well, that's about it. That completes the time-lapse demonstration for Perfect 10 and American Bliss. I truly, sincerely hope that you enjoyed that little, well, I don't know if you could call it a tutorial, a commentary, really, on my process. I hope that you learned a lot, that there's a few takeaways that you'll be able to use within your own work. If you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, I highly suggest that you check out www.howtodrawcomics.net. We got a link in the description to it below. What you'll find over on the site is a bunch of written tutorials, video tutorials. Heck, we've even got a podcast. And when you're ready to take your comic art skill set to the next level, then I highly suggest you check out our library of comic art tutorials. Also, be sure to head on over to our first comic book that Corey Barton, my brother, my dear brother, are doing. It's called Kozor, Descent into Madness. It's a dark fantasy horror fest, essentially, where you'll find grizzled warriors battling against foul beasts. It's a nightmare-driven story that Corey himself has written and that I am helping him to illustrate. Whether it be the line work, whether it be the coloring, we're kind of doing this together. It's a true Barton Bros collaboration. It's still open. You can support it if you would like to, if you like what you see. And that's about it. Again, thanks so much for watching. Until next time, look after yourself. Take care. Keep on practicing, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye-bye.